let's get into my IntelliJ here and do some magic with the code, and I will actually create a new project. So I plan to create a project from scratch and code it together with you, because that's the way I like to work. I don't really like to start with an already existing project. I know that's bad because it can happen a lot of things during live codings, but I assume that, and I really like to do live coding. So let's actually start in creating our own authorization and resource server. Which type of OAuth2 implementation do you explain? Where at the moment we were actually discussing only about OAuth2 in general. So in my case, I didn't decide yet which of the grant types I will use, but as you will see with Spring Security, it's basically pretty easy to implement any of these, and you can even have a client that can use all of them at the same time. You can just refer to all of them for the moment, because I don't implement code for a specific one. And then when we finish with issuing the token, and yes, you will find out that there are multiple possibilities or multiple grant types in which you can achieve that. Then we can decide on actually how does the resource server use the tokens. So you see, if you refer to OAuth2, is basically you have to think about two main things. One of them is how the token is issued. The second one is how the token is validated. And we now refer to the first step. Let's find out how to issue the token. And basically, if maybe it would be even better to complete this list of grant types here. So implicit and the password grant type, we usually don't use them. Implicit grant type, we don't use it at all. Password grant type sometimes, and maybe even now with examples only, because it's the fastest one. And then you have the client credentials as well. Credentials. And this is a special grant type because it doesn't refer to a user. It is one of the grant types you use when you access an endpoint, or you'd like to implement some functionality where you access an endpoint that's not related to a specific user. And this is pretty often today when using, for example, an orchestration tool like Kubernetes, for example. When you use Kubernetes, you actually have that liveness probe and readiness probe. I'm not sure if all of you have used Kubernetes up to now, but I can tell you that what Kubernetes does, one of the things it does, it's an orchestration tool for containers in which you have applications. So one of the things it does is it tests that your application is still alive, and it can either decouple your application if it's not alive anymore, or it can, for example, completely restart your application. It destroys the container and it spins up another container. And in order to do that, it basically, one of the ways to implement that is calling an endpoint of your application. That's pretty often used in practice. But where is the grant type coming here? Well, when Kubernetes calls an endpoint of your application, it becomes a client of your application, isn't it? But when it calls an endpoint that simply only tests the application, I think you agree with me, it's not related to a specific user. It's just related for your orchestration tool being able to actually test that the application is still alive. So, well, in this case, you need a grant type in which offers Kubernetes a possibility to obtain an access token without needing the user or the approval of a specific user. So that's where you will use client credentials. So this client credentials is the tool you use to obtain an access token when you don't have a user or you have something that's unrelated to a user. And what I've told you with Kubernetes is one of the, let's say, most encountered situations nowadays. I'm pretty sure you know Kubernetes is a pretty common tool used nowadays for orchestrating containers, especially in cloud environments. And cloud environments, again, OAuth2 is one of the most encountered ways in which you implement authorization and authentication for your applications in cloud environments. And of course, we have another special grant type here called the refresh token. So the refresh token is also special because you use it to obtain a new access token while already having an access token. So it's a way to refresh your access token. And is that way I did recommend you that I said usually don't use the password grant type. If you do decide to use the password grant type, at least don't store the credentials on the client side. You have a refresh token grant type out there that can help you obtain a new access token without at least storing the credentials. So don't do that mistake on storing the credentials. So now let's go and see how do we actually implement an authorization server using one of those, because again, we discuss on general one of those, you will see immediately why. So I'm starting with a new project. Again, I really love live coding, and here I prefer to use always the latest version, which happens to be Java 14 for the moment in case of Java. And yes, I'm using Java now. And say manning example 1 authorization server, because that's what I'm implementing here. It's an authorization server, and I will be adding here in my Spring Boot project just the needed dependency for my application. Because it's a web application, I of course need the Spring Web, and because we are using Spring Security, I of course do need to add the Spring Security. And then I also need to use the OAuth2 cloud dependency for my authorization server, and I do continue, I say next, I say finish. So I have nothing here for the moment. Let's see with a very newly created project, which are the steps for you to create an authorization server. I still have to wait a very time just my project to be indexed by IntelliJ here, and I think it just finished to index it. You see here I have my only main class. And of course, the way to go with it now is just to create a configuration class. So I will, as I do always, separate my classes by responsibilities, and for that I do create a separate config package, and inside my config package I will create what's called the, let's say, user management config, because again, what the authorization server does, its main responsibility is managing users. So that's why here you will see users managed. You will see user management happening here. And of course, then I have to actually use my configuration, the configuration annotation here to mark it as a configuration. And what else do I have to do? I need the user. So in case of Spring Security, you might already know that the component, the component dealing with users is the user details service, represented by the user details service contract. The user details service contract allows our project now to know which are our users, and usually you do store your users somewhere. It can be a database. Some decide to use another tool like an LDAP or something like that. In our case, because we would go too deep into the configuration, I will simply choose to make it an in-memory. We usually, for POCs, use the in-memory user details service, user details manager actually, to manage users when we only need to have one user and you want to use it. So what do I need to do here? Well, define my user details manager is an in-memory user details manager, and I do return this user details manager. And of course I need at least a user that I can test with. So let's define a user, and maybe the easiest way to define a user in this case is just using the user builder. So let's call it Bill. This is our user. We need a password, and for the moment let's put it 1 2 3 4 5 in plain text, so that's very easy for you to understand what happens here. I need to have an authority. Of course, as someone already specified in the comments, you might actually have as well a role. In this case, that's only where it matters, when you will apply the authorization configuration on the resource server side, so we don't care for that for the moment. And of course I need to call the build method, and if I did build this and I don't add it actually to be managed by my user details manager, then it's for nothing. And there is no user management without a password encoder. So let's actually use a password encoder. So I can actually use a password encoder. What you will see in a lot of examples is that people prefer to use the no password encoder. You will see it cut out with a line because it's marked deprecated. This password encoder, it doesn't encrypt anyhow your password. That's why it's marked as deprecated. It's only working when you when you do POCs or examples, but never use that in a real world scenario. So in a real world scenario, you would prefer to rather use something like bcrypt, for example. Now, if you would like us to continue with bcrypt, and let's say we continue with bcrypt, one of the things you need to do is make sure that the password is also bcrypted. So let's actually do that. I will use the same password encoder to encode my password. So of course, when you do use a password encoder, you need to have a crypted password with the same algorithm, with the same logic as the one you use to match the password afterwards. Also mind that this is actually not a hashing, so that means that if you have the hash, you won't be able to get back to the password. That's why the password encoder doesn't have some kind of a decode, method. It only has an encode method and it has a matches method. So the matches means that you will provide the password you want to prove, and the encoding and the algorithm should be able to prove that a specific password matches a specific encoding, but you will never be able with a hashing algorithm get back the password, the plain text password from the hash itself. That's pretty important because again, if someone would steal your the hashed password, it can do nothing with it. So that's the logic behind it. So that's our actually user management. And now to make sure that we can plug this into our authorization server, what I will basically do is extending the web security configurer adapter and exposing my manager bean, my authentication manager bean, into the context so that I can plug it in afterwards in the authorization server configuration. So I put it in the context. In the terms of Spring Security, the authentication manager is that component that is called from the filter level and deals with the authentication. Usually deals with the authentication through the means of some what we call authentication providers. So a lot of details about this you'll find in the book itself. And I hope you'll actually enjoy and find that book very useful. So now that I have it, I have my authentication manager in the Spring context. I can actually separate and create another class for my authorization server config, and that has to also be a configuration class, and it has to extend authorization server configurer adapter, which we will use to configure our authorization server. And again, if we'd like this to be an authorization server, don't forget to enable the functionality by using the enable authorization server annotation here. And that's how now, by overriding the configure methods, we'll actually be able to define some clients. So this way we will make sure that the authorization server we built here knows about the clients that will be able to access its functionality. So we need some clients. Usually their credentials also come from a database, but again, to make our example shorter here, I will simply put them in memory. Usually with examples you use the users and the clients in memory, but in real world scenarios you you grab them from a database or from another specific location. Here, let's say we have with client and we provide a client ID, and a client also have a secret. These are just some normal credentials. So they are just some username and password, let's call them like this, for the client. So the client also has to authenticate itself, and the authorization server in OAuth2 keeps separate the credentials of the client from the credentials of the user, of course, because they identify different things. One of them, the client credentials, identify the client application, while the user is just the user identified by their own credentials, which they know. So we need client and the secret. And if I did actually use here, if I did configure the password encoder like this, well, what I need to do is I need to make sure here that I will encode this password as well with the same password encoder. And I do also have the option to encode the password and to use a different password encoder if I'd like for this secret. But in our case here, let's just simply use the password encoder we have. So to do that, I simply inject it from the context because I have it in my Spring context here. So I can simply directly auto wire it, and then I should be able to actually encode my secret. If I don't encode the secret, then the application won't be able to match it because it will try to use the bcrypt password encoder I configured in the other class, and of course having a plain text password that won't ever match on bcrypt hash. Always I need to specify the scope. That is actually the scope of the client, usually used within the authorization server configurations, and that's where things start to get some shape. Now we need to specify the grant type. So this is where I was actually showing you here. You have the possible authorization codes here. You basically see them, and we have to specify our client which of these might use. So in our case here, yes, I will actually specify that I need, let's say, the authorization code and the password grant type. For the moment, we can just leave these two. So if I do enumerate the password, the grant types like this, they will basically simply be the ones that our client can use in this specific situation. So yeah, that's basically it. So now that we have the client as well, what else we need to do? Well, it won't work if I don't actually override another configure method I do here, just to be able to specify my authentication manager. The reason for why I added it to the context here is because I really want to be able to plug it in here. So authentication manager, auto wire it from the context and plug it in here where I need it. So that's basically it. So with this, now I should actually be able to run my authorization server and even use it. So you see, you asked me previously where do we specify about which of these we actually discuss, and I said generally, because for my implementation they are just simply some grant types you choose from, and you can specify here for your client whatever grant type you'd like to use. So I even have the possibility to specify that my clients can use both authorization code and password, and even refresh token if I want. Usually in real world scenarios you have one or two, and I rarely see and I do not recommend you to have the authorization code and the password grant type at the same time. Even though I've seen that happening in some project I've done consultancy for, I do recommend you strongly to use the authorization code and avoid using the password and the implicit grant type. But again, do use the password grant type in examples because it really spares you some time. I will show you immediately why. And let me start my application here and see if it's working. And if I didn't miss any kind of configuration, it will actually be working nicely, and we will be able to prove that we can obtain an access token. And then I will tell you about what an opaque access token is versus a JWT access token, because this is another very important thing related to OAuth2 that you need to understand well before working on an application, because again, you really need to know all your deals before writing an application. If you don't, well, then you might miss some things, like for example the best way to actually implement for your requirements. So you see my application started in less than 10 seconds here. That means that I should be able to use a tool like Postman. And yeah, if you really like, you could actually use a CURL, for example, if you are in a console. But to make it easier for us to understand here, I've chosen to use a Postman in this video. And I will try to call using the post HTTP method here the endpoint related to obtaining the tokens. So in my Postman now, what it does, it acts like the client. So the Postman is actually my client, simulating that Angular, React, iOS, Android, whatever you want. And then Postman should be able to obtain the token, calling the token endpoint, which was exposed. So assuming I now use the password grant type, I will say I use the grant type password. And if I use the password grant type, and that's one of the reasons I use here the password grant type, is to show you why it's not okay to use the password grant type once more in real world scenarios. The client needs to know the user's credentials. So imagine that you have an application on your mobile phone and you know that it uses the password grant type. Now you know, if you know that using the password grant type, you know that it knows your credentials. Would you trust that application on your mobile phone? That's my question for you. So probably most of you will say no, because yeah, I don't want my passwords to be actually stored in some kind of any place in my mobile device, because my mobile device might then get stolen and someone might find a way to find my credentials, which is of course not something I'd like to happen. So username, what was actually the username we set up? I don't remember anymore, but we can find it's Bill, and then we have 12345 as the password. So it's Bill, and then the password is 12345, and then I need to ask for a scope, which is the scope in which our client acts. And this scope basically is requested whenever you do request an access token. You request it for a specific scope. The client has to specify this scope, and then on the resource server side, you might want to use this scope to implement it with your authorization rules. So that's it. And then of course, by using by default basic authentication, the client with its secret, which in our case, if I remember correctly, is client and secret, has to authenticate themselves. And then I do send the request. You have seen me pressing the send button here. Everything is fine and nice. Our application works correctly. So you see, even live coding still works sometimes. I do that all the time. Actually, I do like even failing in live coding rather than you coming here with an already developed project. It's more fun like that. And you see the response here basically got me back the access token, and of course some other related very small things. This bearer here in OAuth2, it actually means anybody having the token can use it to access resources. So it's some kind of telling you be very careful not to lose that, because someone having that might actually use your resources. And then of course the token usually has some expiration time. This is configurable, you can configure it, and then it also tells you the scope.